All right, well, it's 3 past, so let's go ahead and jump in so we can maximize our time. So I'll give a little bit of a background of kind of the session. I recognize a lot of the faces in the room, so welcome to the, this is a Connect and Collaborate on Intergroup Relations. And we have Evan Apfelbaum from Boston University here as our session lead. So well known in the field, really a true expert in this area. And for those of you who've been to another Connect and Collaborate, I apologize you heard the bit of a spiel, but Nir and I are your second year outgoing now board of directors members, so we're charged with organizing the Connect and Collaborate series. And when we talked about what concepts we wanted to feature as sort of session topics, we immediately thought we have to have one on intergroup relations and we have to have Evan lead it. So we were super excited that he accommodated us and was willing to come lead the hour. We thank you in advance. I know for a lot of you who've been in these before, active participation is key. Breakout rooms will be expected to do that. So thanks so much for your active participation. We're really excited to have Evan leading us in this hour. So without further ado, Evan, it's yours. Thanks so much for being here.
That's great. Thank you so much, Laura and Nir, to be here. They just told me before everyone joined how engaged everyone was in the prior session. So as I told Nir, that might stop right now. But no, in all seriousness, thank you for being here. It looks like afternoon, night, depending on where you might be. I know this is the latest Nir has ever been up. You know, intergroup relations it always feels timely, but you know, I think that's taken on a new meaning for me and for many people in this space in recent months. And I don't really want to spend too much time talking. I mean, this is an area that I've been sort of waist deep in research-wise for over 15 years. I think about it all the time. And I really want to use most of this hour to sort of create a structure where we can talk about this. I want to hear about what people think are sort of the most interesting and important questions to ask right now, what people are working on. To sort of scaffold that, I've just brought a few really very brief slides that actually only have data on them from recent Pew Trends, which is a place that I often go when I'm trying to get a sense of, you know, a finger on my pulse, what it is right now about current events. So there may be, when you think about what are the most important intergroup relations questions out there right now, you may have a lot of types of answers to that, and I think there's certainly an ability to voice that in a moment. But what I'd like to do to try to get started is two of the things that many of us, whether we like it or not, certainly for COVID, is very salient, are the issues associated with COVID, as well as Black Lives Matter and the killing of a number of Black and brown people that have been in the media and been very central for a number of weeks and months now. And so I want to show you some data, and let's see if I can already pass the here. I'm going to share a quick screen. Let's see if it works. Okay, can people see this? Awesome. So I just told this is very new. You can get from Pew Research. I just want you to think about this just as sort of fodder for starting to think about what you think, what are you drawn towards? Either something that has been unanswered by research, something that our research could inform, or really what this tells. And so this is the first couple slides I'll show you about Black Lives Matter in particular, and then I'll show you one related to COVID. And again, this is just a snippet. So these data are asking people essentially to what extent they support the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a couple things I think are really interesting about these data. One is that if you look at that, right, there's a large percentage of people who are saying that they support at some degree the Black Lives Matter movement. So in some sense, when I see these data, though they get more complicated when you break it down by political views, this is really powerful. I ask myself from a research perspective, well, why is this happening? Sort of why now? What is different? I mean, there's a lot of Black and brown people who have been killed before. Is it something about the specific events of George Floyd? Is the sort of intergroup landscape in the United States somehow different than it was before? And then I also think about, well, what does this mean? what's next. Another interesting piece of data that sort of goes along with this is we know people don't tend to talk about race, particularly white Americans, majority group members. The data is largely from the United States on this, but look at the percentage of people who are now at least self-reporting that they have had conversations associated with race or racial equality in the last month. These are, even if you take them with a grain of salt, a huge deviation from what I would say much of the research would lead you to guess would be happening behind closed doors. And so very interesting to see sort of these differences. I'm going to show you two other slides, and then I'm going to sort of throw people into breakout rooms. These are still about Black Lives Matter. And here's kind of where it gets a little bit, you can start to see the complexity in these data. So, you know, in some sense, the first two images I showed you of data on the first slides paints a rosy picture. People are talking more about race and race equality. People are supportive in some sense of this. It suggests a progressive undercurrent. And what you'll see here is that it's pretty interesting. So these are the people's impressions of what the state of race relations is, particularly with respect to Trump. So what you'll notice here is that there are differences by racial background of participants. So a lot of people think it's gotten worse, but there's variability on that. But if you look at the far bottom there, look at the difference between Republican or leaning Republicans and Democrat and leaning Democrats in terms of the interpretations of this. I mean, these are vast divides in terms of how people are viewing this. Another way of looking at this, when you think about how would you address the issue of Black inequality, again, if we are zooming in on Black Lives Matter, I also thought this was really, really interesting. There are certain issues like working directly with Black people to solve problems in their local communities that there is some divide, but there is some consistency there. Whereas when you look at things like working to get more Black people elected in office, organizing protests and rallies, even bringing people to talk about race, very different ideas about how you would address racial equality. So again, these are things I want to offer, as I said before, as sort of scaffolding or as trappings that we can start thinking about what does this mean? What is the nature of the intergroup divides? They are seemingly intersectional to some degree. And how is this moment sort of different from ones that we have seen before, and what will sort of the future hold? So those are the things that I think of. With respect to COVID, I can't really do it justice in a slide, but I'm going to try to just take two small pieces here. This is very interesting to me. This is recent data, again, from Pew, and asking people sort of what is driving the disproportionately higher rates of hospitalization of Black Americans from COVID-19. So we know that is happening, the disproportionate rate, but people are making different attributions for why this is happening. And it's sort of very interesting from a psychological lens to think through this for me, where you have people sort of responding whether they think it's based on people's lifestyles and personal choices versus circumstances beyond their control. So, you know, this feels like it's straight out of a social psych textbook in terms of the types of dispositional attributes people are making, or situational ones for that matter. And again, you can see there are differences between racial groups of the participants responding, but very, very big differences between Republican-leaning and Republican people who have self-identified as such, as compared with Democrats and Democratic-leaning people. And so I just think that when we swallow this as a pill, we see in some sense progress in terms of dialogue, in terms of people tuning into these issues, but there are, in other ways, greater divides that have been roused and inflamed by these. And it's very interesting to think about what that means and what is next. A final piece that I'll put up here is the self-reporting of sort of negative experiences that are indicative of prejudice or suggestive of prejudice. People reporting essentially the extent to which they feel like the following things have happened to them since coronavirus. And there's much more data like this, but what these data sort of suggest is that Black and Asian participants in particular, and in a number of the other sources of data I've seen, it really points to Asians in particular feeling like they've been targeted, and in many cases actually have been targeted by instances of discrimination. And so thinking about, again, we have these societal events that are sort of these external environmental forces that shock the system, and they stir up the intergroup relations within a societal context, and certainly in ways that bleed into the workplace. And so these are data points that I find very interesting and sort of good fodder for research. We really should be in a place where we can use our knowledge and expertise to help inform and provide some insight on them. So without further ado, I'm going to just put you guys into breakout rooms for maybe 20 minutes or so. And the idea would be in there to have a discussion about sort of what do you see as the most important sort of critical issues that researchers should be thinking about right now with respect to intergroup relations, and sort of what does that mean? And then we'll come back and everyone will have an opportunity to sort of hear what people are talking about and an opportunity to maybe think about some projects that may currently be underway or could come of this. Does that sound reasonable? That was more talking than I planned. Okay, awesome. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So hope you guys had an interesting conversation. I'd love to hear, again, I'm just gonna moderate here, but I'd love to hear what in your own group discussions stuck out to you as like the critical questions that jump out to you as that need work or you think are most pressing right now.
So I'm happy to get us started and kind of in our group, one thing that came up is that people are forming very fast, quick judgments about others, usually based on some group or salient cues as to their group membership based on behavior such as whether or not they wear masks in the context of COVID-19, right? So it's almost enabling or triggering behaviors in a much in a heightened way relative to before.
So do you mean like, because actually, I don't know if that was one of the slides, but the Pew data was pretty interesting as a starting point. I don't know if that's what you're reacting to, but people make different attributions of an Asian or a Black person with a mask as compared to a white person. Were you reacting to that, Nir, or was it something like that?
So it's that's part of it. It's also the kind of change in how much time people take to form these judgments, right? So it seems like people are less patient and take less time maybe to take other people's perspectives in or ask them why they're not wearing a mask and so on. So kind of people feel that the situation entitles them to form quick, snap judgments and hold very strongly to them.
Yeah, related to that, we were also talking about just the value of conversations. For example, whether you should make these kind of snap judgments, whether they are accurate, whether it's possible to actually let people first tell you why they don't want to wear masks. And then maybe that helps people to be more willing to, more open because they feel that they are heard, their concerns are taken seriously. So that's also related to what we were just talking about.
It's interesting how the absence of a mask could be a threat, though, in a certain situation. Like it's like flipping everything in the way that we had traditionally thought about it. Really, really, really interesting. So one thing that I'll just pose that we talked a little bit about in our group, so why, and this brings it back to Black Lives Matter again, which has sort of taken hold internationally to some degree, is what do you think was different about George Floyd's killing? Why is this sort of why did this prompt such a response? And what do you think that means for our understanding of intergroup relations? I think a lot about what that is. I mean, I'll just throw out one hypothesis, which is that it was very salient, right? Not that we don't have body cam videos of other things, but like you see it in such a salient, palpable way. You can ask yourself, would Black Lives Matter movement have gained such steam and exposure if George Floyd was killed outside the lens of a camera? It's interesting to think about, but is that enough to explain sort of what's going on? How do you make sense of it?
I'd agree with you, the salience, but I'd also put in there that in combination with the brutality of it, that it was a very brutal, visually, you could watch this thing happen. So it became very visceral, I think, for many of the people, and the problems that have existed in Minneapolis for a long time with the police. So I think that there was a powder keg already here, and that was not just a spark, that was a blowtorch to address what you're referring to.
I think that I think that in the context of the COVID pandemic, in our group, we talked about people not having the distractions of going to the movies or having sports teams to follow. So it becomes a lot easier to latch on to current events, and a very salient current event usually are people dying. But this time, not only was it racially charged, but there's nothing to really turn to after that. I think that an interesting conversation that we had in our group was the extent to which people's attention occupies various controversies, such as the racism we've seen towards Asian Americans and towards Black Americans in the recent months, and trying to sort out the extent to which we're able to pay attention to those different but still related controversies, I think drives the way we've been responding to them recently.
So can you say more about that? Like in what way?
I was going to say, I was going to add, but Meredith,
go. Sorry.
Yeah, so exactly on that point. So that was one of the points that we were discussing. I was also going to bring it up because it's obviously Black, Asian, African Americans and Asian Americans are two minorities in the United States, and both of them are subject to racism, right? Both of them are subject to stereotypes, but very different type of stereotypes, right? And very different behaviors and victims of very different type of oppression and disadvantages. But we had an interesting conversation where, is there a fixed pie for hatred and racism and discrimination, or is it expanding, right? Can you sort of actively act against both of them at the same time? Do they even exacerbate each other, right? So even if those who even if not consciously does what hatred or racism against one make you more likely to also endorse racist beliefs, right, or racist attitudes against the other one while they're happening, or is it actually the opposite way around, right? So do you only have space to sort of hate one? And if you're hating one, are any negative thoughts and negative attention about the other one less likely to pervade? So I really don't know, and I think the last few months are, whether it's a coincidence or not, they are a really intriguing situation where both of those come together. And we're even thinking about civil rights and feminism in the 60s and 70s, where it was sort of like a delicate balance, and they ended up not intertwining much. And we can have a discussion about whether they benefited or not out of that. But the last few months are, and even from a research perspective, right, a really unique situation where they both, the same evening news will be talking about both of them together. And does that, are they exacerbating each other because of it or not? And I've been talking about the negative, but we can also think about the positive, right? So if we do something to help address one, to help attenuate racism in one, are we, is there a spillover effect into the other, or is it actually the opposite, right? So if we pay attention and try to support one group, does the other group actually end up being less supported and actually being more victim of racism or not? And I really don't know where I fall on those sides. I think it's a really, really intriguing question.
I can tell you that the president of Boston University wrote an email initially that put both Black Lives Matter and COVID-19 in the same email, and we didn't know it about the time, but he got another email 48 hours later with a big apology saying, "I'm sorry that I minimized." Different people thought each issue was minimized, right?
Yeah.
Because it was put in the same. So you had to end up writing two separate emails that then focused on each. But I think it's sort of in some interesting way parallels with your point that they are happening they're overlaid on top of each other, but each one in and of itself is a really big deal. But yeah.
And yet we're all and presumably all aiming for the same thing, right? Which is greater equality, less discrimination, right? Equal opportunities.
I don't know if everyone is. Do you think everyone is aiming for that?
Presumably, right? I mean, that's an even. I guess that's the first question you need to ask.
I think that raises a really interesting question of whether there can be a discussion in society about these issues without bringing politics into the picture, right? Whether that can stay at the level of just discourse about the human condition without turning into political agendas.
Yeah, that's the thing, is I would want to believe that we can actually do them both at the same time. Because if we're about if we're about equality and diminishing racism and equalizing opportunities, then that should apply equally for every human being, regardless of what particular type of discrimination they've been subject to. But it ends up feeling like, instead of supporting each other, instead of finding the ways that, instead of learning and creating opportunities for bringing the forces together, it becomes a tribal discussion. And those who are trying to solve it are part of who is tribalizing it. Maybe that doesn't work. That word doesn't exist, but
I think it makes sense. Go near.
So I want to pose a question to the group, if I may. So I'm curious to know your thoughts. How much do you think that socioeconomic status is potentially a link between these two things? So perhaps the most vulnerable communities, the ones that are most vulnerable to both of these issues that we're discussing, are the ones that are lowest on the SCS ladder.
I think that is true. That's a feature of both. I think where my mind goes is, well, what does that mean in terms of what do we do about it, right? And I mean, some people will talk about reparations as a way. There's this. If you haven't read it and you're interested in the 1619 Project, New York Times, is really fascinating. I learn a lot from reading these articles, and the people who make cases for reparations essentially will argue that at the root of what is happening is economic disadvantage for generations. And so that is a key way to sort of reverse that. But I think, you know, I don't know if that's where you were going near, but I think, I guess I agree that they're lower SES is probably correlated with susceptibility to COVID, as well as,
I think
yeah.
It's kind of like my answer to your question of why now, why this intensity, and I think it's relative deprivation meets an exacerbating factor of COVID-19, right? So unemployment and health concerns and racial tensions all on top of each other. So that's kind of the result we see.
I think there. Sorry, there's a massive plane now. I think there might also be a factor of employment law, at least like certainly in the UK. So we have people on short-term contracts who don't have any kind of employment protections, and that's definitely SES dictated. So you're far more likely to be in a contract, a 0 hours contract where people can let you go. I know we have national health insurance, but I think in the US, the situation is similar in terms of, do you have health insurance as a part of your job? That, at least here also, I think that's why Black Lives Matter movements, I think in London, also felt very central, because there's a large degree to which people who have to continue working in services are now more exposed to COVID, and they are people from ethnic groups that are marginalized. So I think that was definitely an interplay.
So I'm curious, I asked this in our little group, but I'm curious what people think. Do people think that the current discussions about equality and anti-racism, et cetera, will sort of fizzle and we will go back to the way that it was 6 months ago? Or do people think that this is going to take a different trajectory?
I want to give the optimistic answer, but the realist in me is not feeling optimistic. But I think that's why, like, we look to structural changes that can be implemented, that when our internal motivation and awareness and the media coverage of this fades, those that framework is in place, right? I think that's the argument for momentum, but I definitely would love to hear from a more optimistic viewpoint if someone has it.
I'm a little bit more optimistic, I think. I mean, some of the analyses I've read have argued, even if you just look at pictures of protests in the 60s in the States, for example, I know this is very US-centric, but versus now, you can see huge differences in who's coming out and who's speaking out, and all of these things. And historically, I mean, if you kind of believe in regression to the mean, if we think that Trump is an extreme in one way or the other, no matter if you see it as positive or negative, then, you know, maybe it should kind of swing back well, I'll be biased, in a good direction as a result. But hope dies last, right?
I also have mixed feelings, but the idealistic me thinks that it all depends on what we do. And I think the question I have is what we can do to either tag along this momentum or tap into this, what's going on, the conversations right now, what we can do as researchers. Like, is it collaborating with industry partners? Is it offering suggestions on public policies? I would love to think that it all depends on what we do, or maybe a small portion of it. Not all, but hopefully a little bit.
I agree with that your statement. I think that it's not always the case that, you know, administrators and universities or leaders in organizations are saying, okay, we're listening, you know, tell us what we should do. And so I do think this is an opportunity to make voices heard and to say, well, our data suggests this and research suggests that, and you shouldn't do this or you should consider doing that, because I don't know that people will be listening so intently in the future. And so sort of what Andrea says, I don't know if I see that as a pessimistic view. I think I see it more as an opportunistic view, in the sense that, you know, it's like outside of in any change initiative in an organization, like a new leader comes and there is an opportunity to sort of listen, and where you have people's sort of ears and stuff. And I think that fades. And so I think if you see this as a window where people are really uncertain and care about equality, it's an important time to sort of insert a voice and say, here's where research stands. I don't know if that will last. I also think that what I try to, when I talk to people, I do try to speak about structures as well. Trained as a social psychologist, we think more about attitudes and beliefs and stuff like this, and those are important, but I don't think that changing people's attitudes and beliefs is going to be enough to make the sort of changes that people are hoping for. And so I think changing the structures within the organizations, not just how people sort of implicit biases within them, is a critical thing for people to say. And many of the organizations have just done a diversity training where they're slapping knees with pictures, and that's it. So I think moving beyond that is really important.
I think there's a couple things. I don't know if I'm up or not.
Go ahead, Michael.
We hear you.
I think there's a couple things. One is obviously the COVID issue and how long that lasts. But I think the most important part of it is the collaborative piece of it. If we take what we're going on now and we're able to progress with that in a collaborative manner. You kind of talked about organizations. When you have somebody come into an organization, they just come in, kick in. We used to call it when I was with a big company. You take names, kick people out, you make a complete reorganization of it. That's not the way to do it. That's the short-term solution. And when we go at it as we are now a little bit in some of the, the extreme way of passing this message, that's going to happen again with this situation. But if we can get into a collaborative where we're talking about long-term and building a long-term plan, and I think we have a chance to, if the right people stand up and take lead on this, then that will make the change that we need to make. And it will be a longer lasting piece. And I think that's the biggest issue, is it's going to be collaborative, or are we going to take it into the road we're going right now?
One question. Oh,
go ahead.
I was going to ask one question. I would love the more experienced minds in the group to weigh in on. And to Evan's point, is yes, there's an opportunity for sort of structural interventions to capitalize on this moment. And I think about attitude change, and one method is to try to change attitudes and then implement sort of these behavioral changes. But the other is sort of to implement structural changes, and through that exposure, change beliefs. Like I think about social attitudes towards gay marriage, and it's a little bit of a chicken and egg because it happens simultaneously, but the passing of legislation to legalize gay marriage and the increasing approval of gay marriage, it's like which is influencing which. But in our group, we also had the conversation that when you have sort of extreme measures, you get backlash where it isolates the other group more. And so I'm curious if people feel like implementing these structural changes, like grabbing it and running with it, is going to lead to greater polarization, or is an opportunity to basically show people, look, it's going to be okay. The world's not going to come to an end if we make these structural changes. And so I'm curious what people's thoughts are.
I'm sort of with Michael on that, because I think that putting myself in somebody else's shoes, I don't know how it feels to hear somebody say, you're terrible, you need to change your attitudes and behavior, instead of going, I mean, the first reaction is, me? Not in a lifetime, right? You wouldn't like your attitudes and behaviors changed in any way. So I think that what Michael says makes to me a lot more sense as an approach, this collaborative path where you sort of engage everybody to solve problems, to do whatever it takes to make things better, rather than increase the polarization. I'm really concerned about this polarization and about people looking at the same thing, be it COVID, being the masks or anything, and seeing totally different things, although in some cases there's facts in there that we should all be able to agree to. It's so polarized that we can't look at facts anymore, except through a frame that keeps us in our boxes. So I'm hopeful for Michael's approach. I'm waiting for him to change the world the way he proposes.
Like to.
Muted.
Oh.
Guys, thank you so much. We are a few minutes over, but I know this was the last stop on your journey, and I appreciate you staying awake for those of you who are up past your bedtime. It's nice to see you. Hopefully next year we can do it in person.
Yes.
And thank you so much for coming and chatting, and hopefully you have some interesting thoughts to back to your lab or to your research team, and I'm happy to chat with anyone after this to speak about any research direction. Thank you, Nir, again. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Evan, for this
Thank
session,
you.
and thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your IACM.
Thanks. Bye-bye.